The quickest way to reveal a man's character is to give him power over someone he believes cannot fight back. The lunchroom inside Redstone Correctional Facility was louder than usual that afternoon. Plastic trays scraped across metal tables. Conversations bounced off concrete walls. Guards moved through the aisles with practiced indifference, while nearly 200 inmates filled the room with the familiar noise of another ordinary day. At the far corner of the cafeteria sat Samuel Walker. The 68-year-old inmate kept to himself, as he always did. His gray prison uniform looked older than most. A paperback book rested beside his tray. His lunch was simple: a sandwich, an apple, and a small carton of milk. Samuel ate slowly, occasionally turning a page of his book between bites. Most people barely noticed him anymore. He had been at Redstone long enough to become part of the background. Quiet people often disappeared in places like prison. At a nearby table, Kevin Brooks watched the older man with curiosity. Kevin was 24 and had arrived at Redstone less than a year earlier. Unlike many inmates, he paid attention to details. He had noticed something strange about Samuel from the beginning. The old man never seemed angry. He never argued. He never raised his voice. Yet people twice his size somehow lowered theirs whenever they spoke to him. Kevin had never understood why. Across the cafeteria, Travis Miller entered with 3 members of his group following behind him. Conversations immediately shifted. Some inmates looked away. Others watched carefully. Travis enjoyed attention. He enjoyed reminding people that he controlled the room whenever he walked into it. Tall, confident, and always surrounded by followers, he carried himself like a man who believed respect could be taken instead of earned. As he moved through the cafeteria, his eyes landed on Samuel sitting alone in the corner. A slow smile crossed his face. One of his friends noticed. "You looking for entertainment?" Travis glanced toward the older inmate. "Maybe." The group changed direction and began walking toward Samuel's table. Kevin felt a knot form in his stomach. He had seen situations like this before. Usually they ended with somebody embarrassed, angry, or humiliated. Samuel continued reading without looking up. If he noticed the approaching group, he gave no sign. Travis stopped directly beside the table. The room seemed to grow quieter. Several inmates stopped eating altogether. Samuel calmly placed a bookmark between the pages of his book and looked up. "Afternoon," he said politely. Travis stared down at him. "You sitting here all alone?" Samuel nodded once. "Looks that way." A few inmates laughed nervously. Travis looked at the tray in front of the older man. "You planning to eat all that?" Samuel glanced down at his lunch. That was the idea. Without asking permission, Travis reached down, picked up the sandwich from Samuel's tray, and took a step back. One of his friends grabbed the apple. Another took the milk carton. The entire cafeteria watched. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Kevin felt his face tighten. The old man had done nothing to deserve it. Yet Samuel simply looked at the empty tray in front of him. Travis waited for a reaction. Anger, complaints, fear, anything. Instead, Samuel slowly closed his book and folded his hands on the table. "That is it?" Travis asked. Samuel looked up at him with calm eyes. "You can take the meal." Travis smirked. "Good. At least you understand how things work around here." Samuel's expression never changed. "Just do not lose your character while you are taking it." The words landed in the cafeteria like a dropped weight. Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. Even Travis seemed caught off guard for a second. Samuel had not sounded frightened. He had not sounded insulted. If anything, he sounded concerned. Concerned for the man stealing his food. Travis forced a laugh and turned away with his group. "Keep your advice, old man." Samuel simply nodded. "I was hoping you would." As Travis walked across the cafeteria carrying the stolen sandwich, the room slowly returned to life. Conversations resumed. Trays rattled. Chairs moved. Yet something had changed. Kevin looked around and realized that people were no longer watching Travis. They were watching Samuel. The old man opened his book again as though nothing important had happened. His lunch was gone. His table was empty. Yet somehow he looked like the only person in the room who had lost nothing at all. And from the far side of the cafeteria, Officer Raymond Cole stared at Samuel Walker with a strange feeling he could not explain, because the calm voice he had just heard sounded familiar in a way that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Kevin Brooks could not stop thinking about what he had witnessed in the cafeteria. The image stayed with him long after lunch ended. He had seen men lose their tempers over far less. He had seen arguments begin because of a misplaced chair or a careless word. Yet Samuel Walker had watched his entire meal disappear without showing the slightest sign of anger. By evening count, Kevin was still replaying the moment in his mind. After the inmates returned to their cells, he found Samuel sitting alone in the common area with the same paperback book resting in his hands. The older man appeared completely relaxed, as though the afternoon had been no different from any other day. Kevin finally walked over. "Can I ask you something?" Samuel looked up and smiled politely. "You can always ask." Kevin sat down across from him. "Why did you let him do it?" Samuel closed the book and placed a finger between the pages to save his place. "Do what?" Kevin frowned. "Take your food." Samuel thought about the question for a moment. "Because it was only food." Kevin stared at him. "Only food?" Samuel nodded. "A sandwich, an apple, a carton of milk." Kevin leaned forward. "That is not the point." Samuel smiled gently. "Then what is the point?" Kevin opened his mouth but struggled to answer. Finally he said, "He was disrespecting you." Samuel looked around the room. Several inmates were watching television while others played cards beneath the dim lights. "A person cannot hand you disrespect," he said quietly. "They can only offer it." Kevin shook his head. "That does not make sense." Samuel picked up his book again but did not open it. "If somebody throws mud at your shoes, do you have to carry it home?" Kevin sat silently. Samuel continued. "People spend too much time accepting things that were never theirs to begin with." The younger inmate did not fully understand, but something about the answer stayed with him. Across the room, another pair of eyes had been watching the conversation. Officer Raymond Cole stood near the security desk pretending to review paperwork. In reality, his attention had been fixed on Samuel all evening. The old inmate's voice continued to bother him, not because of what he said, but because it sounded familiar. Raymond had worked in corrections for nearly 20 years. He had met thousands of inmates. Yet every time Samuel spoke, a strange feeling tugged at the edge of his memory. Somewhere, years ago, he had heard that calm voice before. Later that night, after lights out, Raymond sat alone in the administration office. A cup of coffee cooled beside him while he stared through the window overlooking the prison yard. He could not explain why he kept thinking about Samuel Walker. Nothing in the inmate's file stood out. No history of violence. No gang connections. No special status. Just an elderly man serving his sentence. Yet Raymond knew something was wrong with that explanation. He opened the file again and studied the photograph clipped inside. Samuel looked exactly as he did now. Calm eyes, straight posture, quiet confidence. Raymond rubbed his forehead. "Where do I know you from?" he muttered. Meanwhile, in another section of the prison, Travis Miller sat surrounded by members of his group. One of them laughed as he remembered the cafeteria scene. That old guy looked terrified. Travis smirked, but said nothing. The truth was more complicated. Samuel had not looked terrified at all. If anything, he had looked disappointed. The memory irritated him. Most people reacted predictably. They got angry. They complained. They tried to defend themselves. Samuel had done none of those things. One of Travis's friends nudged him. "You should mess with him again tomorrow." Travis leaned back in his chair. Maybe. Yet even as he said it, he found himself remembering the old man's words. "Just do not lose your character while you are taking it." The sentence had sounded less like an insult and more like a warning. Not a threat. A warning. And for reasons he could not explain, that bothered him far more than anger ever would. Back in the common area, Samuel eventually reopened his book and continued reading beneath the fading evening lights. Around him, the prison carried on exactly as it always had. Conversations rose and fell. Doors opened and closed. Television screens flickered in the background. But without realizing it, 3 different men had begun thinking about him at the exact same moment. Kevin wanted to understand him. Raymond wanted to remember him. And Travis wanted to prove that the old man was not as unshakable as he seemed. None of them knew it yet, but the stolen lunch had started something much bigger than a simple act of humiliation. The next morning arrived with the same routine sounds that echoed through Redstone Correctional Facility every day. Steel doors opened. Officers called counts. Inmates shuffled through hallways toward breakfast. Yet for Kevin Brooks, nothing felt quite the same. He found himself scanning the crowd until he spotted Samuel Walker moving calmly through the corridor with a paperback book tucked beneath one arm. The older man walked at an unhurried pace, nodding politely to people he passed. It was difficult to believe that less than 24 hours earlier he had been publicly humiliated in front of the entire cafeteria. Kevin caught up with him near the breakfast line. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. Samuel smiled. "Well enough." Kevin hesitated. "You really are not upset about yesterday?" Samuel glanced toward the large cafeteria doors ahead of them. Being upset would not change yesterday. Kevin frowned. Most people would still be angry. Samuel nodded. Most people spend a lot of time carrying things that only make them heavier. Before Kevin could ask another question, they entered the cafeteria. Almost immediately, he noticed heads turning. Word of yesterday's incident had spread through the prison. Some inmates looked at Samuel with sympathy. Others looked at him with curiosity. A few simply stared. Samuel seemed unaware of all of it. He collected his tray, thanked the cafeteria workers serving breakfast, and walked toward his usual table. Officer Raymond Cole watched the scene from across the room. The strange feeling from yesterday had not disappeared. If anything, it had become stronger. He found himself studying Samuel's posture, the way he moved, even the way he thanked people. Everything felt familiar. During his lunch break the previous night, Raymond had searched old memories without success. This morning he intended to try again. Across the cafeteria, Travis Miller entered with his usual group. His eyes immediately found Samuel. One of his friends smirked. "Looks like the old guy came back." Travis stared for a moment. "Of course he did. You going to take his breakfast too?" another asked. Travis did not answer right away. For reasons he could not explain, the idea felt less entertaining than it had yesterday. Samuel's calm reaction had robbed the moment of satisfaction. Instead of looking weak, the old man had somehow made everyone else uncomfortable. Travis disliked that feeling. He liked certainty. Samuel created questions. Meanwhile, Kevin sat across from Samuel and watched him quietly eat. Finally, he said, "Officer Cole keeps looking at you." Samuel glanced toward the far side of the cafeteria where Raymond stood speaking with another guard. "Maybe he is doing his job." Kevin shook his head. "No, it is different." Samuel took a sip of coffee. "Then perhaps he is trying to remember something." The answer surprised Kevin. "How do you know?" Samuel smiled faintly. People have a certain look when they are searching their memory. Across the room, Raymond suddenly looked in Samuel's direction at that exact moment. Their eyes met briefly. A strange chill ran through the officer. There it was again. That feeling. That certainty that he had seen this man somewhere before. Not in prison. Somewhere else. Somewhere important. Later that afternoon, Raymond sat alone in the administration office reviewing old employee records on a computer. He was not entirely sure what he was looking for. His instincts simply refused to let the matter go. As he searched, a faded memory surfaced. A crowded convention center. Applause. A speaker standing on a stage. The image vanished before he could fully grasp it. Raymond leaned back in his chair. "Who are you?" he whispered. Down in the prison yard, Samuel sat beneath the shade of a concrete overhang reading his book while other inmates walked laps or gathered in small groups. Kevin sat nearby pretending to read another novel, though most of his attention remained fixed on the older man. Suddenly, a loose sheet of paper blew across the yard in the afternoon wind. Without even looking up from his book, Samuel calmly reached out and caught it before it could hit the ground. The movement was smooth and effortless. He handed the paper back to a surprised inmate and returned to reading. Kevin stared. The entire thing had happened in less than a second. Samuel looked up and noticed the expression on his face. Something wrong. Kevin shook his head slowly. No, but deep down, he knew something was different about Samuel Walker. And for the first time, he began to wonder if the old man sitting quietly beside him had once lived a life far bigger than anyone inside Redstone could possibly imagine. While Kevin Brooks spent his days trying to understand Samuel Walker, most inmates believed they already understood Travis Miller. In a place like Redstone Correctional Facility, reputations traveled faster than facts, and Travis had spent years building his carefully. At 34 years old, he was one of the most influential inmates in the prison. He was not the biggest man in the yard. He was not the oldest. He was not the smartest. What made Travis dangerous was his ability to recognize fear in other people and use it to his advantage. Many inmates avoided trouble. Travis understood how to become trouble. That understanding had given him influence, followers, and attention. He enjoyed all three. That afternoon, Travis sat with several members of his group in the recreation yard beneath a faded metal shelter. The conversation drifted from sports to prison rumors before eventually returning to the same subject that seemed to occupy everyone's mind. Samuel Walker. One inmate shook his head. I still do not understand why the old man did not react. Another laughed. Maybe he was scared. Travis remained silent. The answer sounded reasonable, yet it felt wrong. He had seen fear many times. Fear looked away. Fear rushed its words. Fear searched for escape. Samuel had done none of those things. The older man had simply looked at him as though he were studying a problem that could eventually be solved. Travis disliked remembering that moment. One of his friends noticed his expression. You are still thinking about him. Travis leaned back in his chair. I am thinking about why everybody else is thinking about him. The group laughed, but Travis was serious. A man who lost his lunch should have been forgotten by dinner. Instead, inmates were talking about Samuel more than ever. Across the yard, Samuel sat on a bench reading his book. Kevin remained nearby, pretending to focus on his own novel. Every few minutes, another inmate stopped to speak with the older man. Some asked questions. Others simply exchanged greetings. Samuel treated each person the same. Calm, respectful, patient. Travis watched the interactions carefully. Look at that, one of his friends muttered. People actually like him. Travis followed Samuel with his eyes. No, they trust him. The answer surprised even Travis. Trust was not something he understood very well. In his experience, people followed whoever made them uncomfortable enough to obey. Yet Samuel seemed to attract people without demanding anything from them. That difference bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Later that evening, after recreation ended, Travis crossed paths with Officer Raymond Cole near the main corridor. The veteran officer barely acknowledged him. Instead, Raymond's attention drifted toward Samuel, who was returning a library book at the end of the hall. Travis noticed immediately. What is so special about him? He asked. Raymond looked over. Who? Travis nodded toward Samuel. The old guy. Raymond hesitated for a moment. I am not sure yet. Then he continued walking. The answer stayed with Travis. Not sure yet. For the first time, he realized he was asking the same question. That night, while most inmates settled into their normal routines, Samuel sat quietly in the common area reading beneath the soft glow of overhead lights. Kevin eventually approached and took a seat nearby. Can I ask you something? Samuel smiled. You usually do. Kevin glanced across the room toward Travis, who was pretending not to look in their direction. Why do you think he keeps watching you? Samuel closed the book gently. People pay attention when something does not fit the story they already believe. Kevin frowned. What story? Samuel looked around the room. That strength must always be loud. Across the common area, Travis could not hear the conversation, but he could see Samuel smile. For reasons he could not explain, that simple smile irritated him more than any insult ever could. And as lights out approached, one thing became increasingly clear. The stolen lunch was no longer the center of the story. The real question spreading through Redstone was much bigger. Who exactly was Samuel Walker? And why did everyone who spent time around him seem to leave with more questions than answers? The following week settled into a rhythm that felt familiar to everyone except Kevin Brooks. The young inmate found himself paying more attention to Samuel Walker with each passing day. It was not because the older man demanded attention. In fact, the opposite was true. Samuel never tried to stand out. Yet somehow people continued noticing him. Every morning, he visited the library. Every afternoon, he spent time reading in the yard. Every evening, he seemed to have a quiet conversation with someone who needed one. Kevin began realizing that Samuel's influence inside Redstone did not come from authority. It came from consistency. One afternoon, the prison education room opened for a volunteer reading program. Several inmates attended simply because it offered a break from routine. Samuel sat near the back with a stack of donated books. Kevin arrived a few minutes later and took a seat beside him. Around the room, men talked quietly while waiting for the program to begin. An older inmate named Harold Jenkins struggled to carry a box filled with paperbacks from one side of the room to the other. Before anyone could react, Samuel stood up and walked over. Let me help you with that. Harold smiled gratefully. I appreciate it. Together they carried the box across the room. It was a simple gesture. Nothing remarkable. Yet Kevin noticed something interesting. Samuel never acted as though helping people deserved recognition. He treated kindness the same way most people treated breathing. It was simply part of who he was. Later, while sorting books, Kevin picked up a worn biography about leadership. Samuel glanced at the cover and smiled. That is a good one. Kevin raised an eyebrow. You have read it? Samuel nodded. Several times. Kevin opened the book and laughed. You have probably read everything in this room. Samuel looked at the shelves around them. Books are interesting. Most people think they teach you what to think. Kevin looked curious. What do they really teach? Samuel placed another novel onto the shelf. How to Ask Better Questions. Across the room, several inmates had begun gathering around Samuel without realizing it. One man asked about finding a good history book. Another wanted a recommendation about business. A third simply wanted advice about writing letters to his family. Samuel answered each question patiently. He never spoke like a lecturer. He spoke like someone who genuinely wanted people to succeed. Kevin watched the interactions carefully. The more he observed, the stranger everything became. Most respected inmates gained influence through intimidation, alliances, or favors. Samuel gained influence simply by being useful. Meanwhile, Officer Raymond Cole stood outside the education room reviewing paperwork. Through the glass window, he could see the small crowd gathered around Samuel. The sight triggered another flicker of memory. Not a prison, not a classroom, a conference hall. Rows of people listening to someone speak. Raymond stopped walking. The image disappeared before he could focus on it. Frustrated, he leaned against the wall. Why do I know him? He whispered. The answer remained just beyond reach. Later that evening in the cafeteria, Travis Miller noticed something he did not like. Two inmates who normally sat at his table were talking about Samuel. The old guy helped me write a letter yesterday, one of them said. Another nodded. He helped me find books for my certification class. Travis set down his fork. You two sound like fans. The men laughed awkwardly. He is just different. Travis frowned. Different. Everybody kept using that word. He glanced across the cafeteria, where Samuel sat alone with his usual book. Several inmates waved as they passed. Samuel acknowledged each one with a simple nod. Travis could not understand it. The old man had no gang, no position, no leverage. Yet somehow people respected him anyway. That realization unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Near the end of dinner, Kevin approached Samuel again. Can I ask something? Samuel smiled. I was wondering how long it would take. Kevin laughed. How do you always know? Samuel closed his book. People reveal themselves long before they reveal their intentions. Kevin paused. The sentence sounded important. What does that mean? Samuel looked around the cafeteria. If you pay attention to what people do consistently, you learn more than listening to what they say occasionally. Across the room, Travis happened to look up at that exact moment. For a brief second, his eyes met Samuel's. The older man simply smiled and returned to reading. Travis looked away first. And although he would never admit it to anyone, he left the cafeteria that evening feeling as though he had somehow lost a conversation that had never even happened. Officer Raymond Cole had reached the point where curiosity was becoming an obsession. For nearly a week, he had watched Samuel Walker move through Redstone Correctional Facility with the same calm confidence that seemed completely out of place inside prison walls. Every day brought another small moment that raised new questions. The older inmate never sought attention, yet people naturally gathered around him. He never spoke loudly, yet others listened when he did. Most importantly, Raymond could not shake the feeling that he had seen him somewhere before. Late one evening, after the final inmate count, Raymond sat alone in the administration office. The prison had grown quiet. Outside the window, security lights illuminated the empty yard. A half-finished cup of coffee sat beside an aging desktop computer. Raymond rubbed his eyes and opened a search database containing archived articles, conference records, and public event photographs dating back decades. He did not have much to work with. Samuel Walker was not an uncommon name. Hundreds of results appeared. Most were useless, yet something told him to keep looking. Meanwhile, Samuel spent the evening in the library helping Mrs. Eleanor Price organize a recent shipment of donated books. Kevin Brooks was there as well. Together, they sorted paperbacks into neat stacks. You know, Kevin said while carrying a box across the room, most people would be tired of my questions by now. Samuel smiled. Most people are tired of their own questions. Kevin laughed. There you go again. Again. Saying things that sound simple until I think about them later. Samuel carefully placed a book onto a shelf. That is usually how good ideas work. Kevin shook his head. The answer only created another question. Across the room, Mrs. Price watched the interaction and smiled. She had volunteered at Redstone for almost 15 years. During that time, she had met every kind of inmate imaginable. Samuel was different. Not because he was unusually intelligent. Not because he was unusually calm. What made him stand out was the way he treated every person as though they mattered. In prison, that quality was surprisingly rare. Back in the administration office, Raymond continued searching through old records. Hours passed. Most results led nowhere. Then something unusual appeared. A photograph from nearly 20 years earlier. The image showed a leadership conference held in Washington, D.C. Hundreds of attendees filled a large auditorium. Raymond leaned closer. On the stage stood a guest speaker whose face was partially obscured by poor image quality. Yet something about the posture immediately caught his attention. Calm, balanced, relaxed. The same posture Samuel carried every day. Raymond opened the article attached to the photograph. Unfortunately, much of the information had been lost during digital archiving. The speaker's name was missing. Only one sentence remained readable. Former instructor praised for developing elite leadership programs. Raymond stared at the screen. Instructor. Leadership programs. The words triggered another flicker of memory. Years ago, he had attended a training seminar during the first months of his corrections career. He remembered a speaker addressing a room filled with law enforcement professionals. The man had spoken quietly, yet nobody had looked away. Raymond sat upright. No, he whispered. It cannot be. The memory remained incomplete, but for the first time, he felt closer to the answer. The following afternoon, the prison yard opened under clear skies. Samuel sat on his usual bench reading, while Kevin worked through another book recommendation. Nearby, a younger inmate struggled with a difficult correspondence course assignment. After several failed attempts, he approached Samuel. Would you mind looking at this? Samuel accepted the workbook and reviewed it for a moment. Then he explained the concept in simple language. Within minutes, the inmate understood what had confused him for days. How did you know that? The young man asked. Samuel handed back the workbook. Teaching becomes easier when you remember what it felt like not to know. The inmate thanked him and walked away smiling. Kevin stared at Samuel. How many things do you know? Samuel laughed softly. Far fewer than I used to think. Across the yard, Travis Miller had been watching the entire exchange. More and more inmates were seeking Samuel's advice. More and more people seemed to trust him. Travis could feel influence shifting in subtle ways. Nobody challenged his position. Nobody confronted him. Yet somehow the old man sitting on a bench with a paperback book seemed to command a kind of respect that could not be forced. That realization bothered him more every day. As evening approached, Raymond stepped into the yard and watched Samuel from a distance. The older inmate looked up briefly and nodded politely. Raymond returned the nod automatically. Then another fragment of memory surfaced. A stage, a microphone, a room full of professionals taking notes, and one sentence spoken by a man whose voice sounded exactly like Samuel Walker's. Raymond could not remember the entire quote, but he remembered the ending. Character is what remains when authority disappears. The veteran officer stood frozen for several seconds. Somewhere deep in his memory, a door had finally begun to open. Over the next several days, something subtle began changing inside Redstone Correctional Facility. Nobody announced it. Nobody planned it. Yet the shift was impossible to ignore. More inmates were spending time in the library. More people were signing up for educational programs. Even conversations in the common areas seemed different. Officer Raymond Cole noticed the change before anyone else. As he walked his daily rounds, he found fewer complaints waiting on his desk and more inmates asking questions about classes, books, and certification courses. At first, he assumed it was a coincidence. Then he started paying attention to where those conversations began. Almost all of them led back to Samuel Walker. One afternoon, Raymond stood outside the library watching through the glass window. Inside, Samuel sat at a table with 3 younger inmates. One needed help preparing for a high school equivalency exam. Another was struggling with a business course. The third simply wanted advice about reconnecting with his daughter after years of silence. Samuel gave each man his full attention. He never rushed. He never acted like he knew everything. Somehow that made people trust him even more. Raymond folded his arms. The feeling of familiarity continued growing stronger. Every day brought another fragment of memory. Yet the full picture remained hidden. Across the yard, Travis Miller had noticed the same changes. He did not like them. Influence inside prison was a delicate thing. For years, people had looked to him because he controlled attention. Now more and more inmates seemed interested in something else entirely. Respect. Real respect. Not fear. Not intimidation. Respect. That difference frustrated him. One evening, he sat with several members of his group during recreation. One of them pointed toward the far side of the yard, where Samuel sat reading beneath a shade structure. "There is your favorite old man." The others laughed. Travis did not. "What makes him so special?" he asked. Nobody answered immediately. Finally, one inmate shrugged. "People feel better after talking to him." Another nodded. "He listens." Travis shook his head. That cannot be enough. Yet deep down he knew it was. The realization irritated him. Across the yard, Kevin Brooks approached Samuel carrying 2 books under his arm. "I have another question." Samuel smiled without looking up from his novel. "That is becoming a habit." Kevin sat beside him. "Officer Cole keeps watching you." Samuel turned a page. "Maybe he is curious." Kevin lowered his voice. "No. I think he remembers something." For the first time, Samuel paused. He closed the book gently and looked across the yard toward Raymond. The officer was standing near the perimeter fence reviewing paperwork. "Memory is an interesting thing," Samuel said quietly. "Sometimes it arrives slowly because we are not ready for it all at once." Kevin frowned. "You talk like you know exactly what he is remembering." Samuel smiled. "I know how memory works." Before Kevin could continue, a sudden gust of wind swept across the yard. Several loose papers blew from a nearby inmate's folder and scattered toward the fence line. Without hesitation, Samuel stood up and helped gather them. A few other inmates joined him. Within moments, every page had been recovered. The inmate thanked everyone repeatedly. Samuel simply handed back the folder and returned to his bench. Kevin noticed something. Samuel never waited for recognition. He never looked around to see who was watching. He helped because helping seemed natural to him. Later that night, Raymond remained in the administration office long after his shift should have ended. The prison had fallen quiet. He sat alone in front of the computer reviewing another collection of archived records. Then he found something new. An old conference brochure from nearly 2 decades earlier. The image quality was poor, but one photograph immediately caught his attention. A speaker stood at the front of a packed auditorium. The caption beneath the image had survived. "National Leadership Development Seminar. Guest instructor Samuel Walker." Raymond stared at the screen. His pulse quickened. He opened the file and scanned the faded text. Most of it had been corrupted over time. Only a few lines remained readable. "Instructor to military leaders, law enforcement professionals, and executive teams nationwide." Raymond leaned back slowly. For several seconds, he simply stared at the photograph. The face was younger, but there was no mistake. The posture, the expression, the calm confidence. It was Samuel. The same Samuel currently serving time inside Redstone Correctional Facility. Raymond looked back toward the dark prison yard outside his window. "Who were you?" he whispered. Yet, even as he asked the question, another realization began forming. Maybe the more important question was not who Samuel had been. Maybe the real mystery was why a man who once taught leaders across the country was now quietly spending his evenings helping strangers organize books inside a prison library. The discovery in Officer Raymond Cole's office changed everything, even though he told nobody about it. The old conference brochure remained open on his computer screen long after midnight. The faded photograph showed a younger Samuel Walker standing before a packed audience, speaking to leaders from across the country. Raymond had spent nearly a week trying to understand why the quiet inmate felt familiar. Now he finally knew he was not imagining it. Yet the answer only created a bigger mystery. Why would a man who once taught military leaders, law enforcement professionals, and executives end up serving time in a state prison? Raymond considered asking Samuel directly. Then he decided against it. Something told him the older man would reveal the truth only when he chose to. The following afternoon, life inside Redstone continued as usual. The recreation yard filled with inmates enjoying several hours outside their housing units. Samuel sat beneath his favorite shade structure with a book resting on one knee. Kevin Brooks arrived carrying a notebook filled with questions. Samuel noticed immediately. "That looks serious." Kevin laughed. "I have been thinking. That can be dangerous." "I am serious." Samuel smiled. "So am I." Kevin opened the notebook. "You always know things." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "That is a dangerous assumption." "No, I mean it. Leadership, history, business, psychology, education. You know something about everything." Samuel closed his book. "I know enough to keep learning." Kevin shook his head. Most people answer questions. You answer questions with better questions. Samuel laughed softly. That usually means somebody had good teachers. The answer caught Kevin's attention. Teachers. Samuel looked toward the open yard. Nobody accomplishes much alone. Nearby, another inmate approached carrying paperwork from a vocational training course. Mr. Walker, could you look at this? Samuel reviewed the material for a moment before explaining a problem-solving exercise in simple terms. Within minutes, the inmate understood what had confused him all morning. Thank you, the man said. You should be teaching classes. Samuel smiled. Everyone teaches something. The inmate walked away, shaking his head in amazement. Kevin watched carefully. This scene repeated itself almost every day. People came to Samuel with questions. Somehow they always left with answers and more confidence than before. Across the yard, Travis Miller observed the interaction from a distance. The frustration he felt was becoming harder to ignore. At first, Samuel had seemed insignificant. Then he became interesting. Now he was becoming influential. That bothered Travis. Not because Samuel wanted power. In fact, the old man clearly wanted nothing. Somehow that made his growing reputation even harder to understand. One of Travis's friends sat beside him. People keep talking about him. Travis folded his arms. I noticed. Maybe he was a teacher before prison. Travis looked across the yard. Maybe. The possibility lingered in his mind. The more he watched Samuel, the more difficult it became to fit him into the image of an ordinary inmate. Later that day, Kevin found Samuel organizing books in the library alongside Mrs. Eleanor Price. A stack of donated biographies sat on the table between them. Kevin picked one up and flipped through it. Can I ask something personal? Samuel smiled. You usually do. Kevin hesitated. What did you do before coming here? For the first time in several seconds, Samuel said nothing. He placed another book onto the shelf before answering. Many different things. Kevin waited. Such as, Samuel looked toward the library window where afternoon sunlight streamed through the glass. I spent a lot of years helping people prepare for difficult responsibilities. Kevin frowned. What kind of responsibilities? Samuel smiled again. The kind that affect other people. The answer sounded simple, yet it somehow felt much larger than the words themselves. Before Kevin could continue, Mrs. Price handed Samuel another stack of books. The conversation ended, but the mystery only grew. That evening, Raymond reviewed the conference brochure one more time. This time he zoomed in on a line printed beneath the photograph. Most of the text was unreadable, but a few words remained clear. National Leadership Development Institute. Guest instructor Samuel Walker. Raymond leaned back slowly. The title sounded important. Important enough that he decided to make a phone call the next morning. Somewhere outside Redstone, someone would know the rest of Samuel Walker's story. And for reasons he could not explain, Raymond felt certain that when the full truth finally surfaced, everyone inside the prison would see the quiet old man very differently. Officer Raymond Cole made the phone call early the next morning before most of Redstone Correctional Facility had fully awakened. The administration building was quiet except for the distant sounds of officers changing shifts. Raymond sat alone at his desk with the old conference brochure open beside him. After several transfers and a few dead ends, he finally reached someone connected to the National Leadership Development Institute. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes, but by the time it ended, Raymond sat frozen in his chair staring at the wall. Everything he had learned raised more questions than answers. The woman on the phone had immediately recognized Samuel Walker's name. Not only recognized it, respected it. Her voice had changed the moment Raymond mentioned him. Before hanging up, she gave him one final piece of information. If it is the same Samuel Walker, she had said, you are talking about someone who influenced thousands of leaders across the country. Raymond slowly placed the receiver down. Thousands. The number echoed in his mind. Meanwhile, Samuel spent the morning exactly as he always did. He visited the library, returned 2 books, and helped Mrs. Eleanor Price unpack another shipment of donations. Nothing about him suggested importance. Nothing about him hinted that he had once spoken to packed auditoriums or trained people in positions of responsibility. Kevin Brooks arrived shortly before lunch, carrying a notebook filled with observations. I figured something out, he announced proudly. Samuel smiled. That sounds dangerous. Kevin laughed. You always do that. Do what? Answer serious things like they are jokes. Samuel slid a book onto the shelf. Life becomes much heavier when you stop laughing. Kevin opened his notebook. I have been writing down things you say. Samuel raised an eyebrow. That seems risky. Listen to this. Kevin cleared his throat dramatically. People reveal themselves long before they reveal their intentions. He turned the page. Teaching becomes easier when you remember what it felt like not to know. Another page. Character is what remains when authority disappears. Samuel paused. I said all of that. Kevin nodded proudly. And there is more. Samuel laughed softly and shook his head. Now I understand why people should never talk too much. Across the room, several inmates smiled as they overheard the exchange. Samuel had become a source of quiet encouragement throughout the prison. Some sought advice. Others simply enjoyed being around him. Nobody seemed able to explain why. Later that afternoon, recreation time brought everyone back into the yard. Samuel sat beneath his usual shelter reading while Kevin worked through a correspondence course assignment. Nearby, Travis Miller watched the scene unfold. The frustration he had been carrying for days had not gone away. In fact, it had become worse. Every time he expected Samuel to react emotionally, the old man remained calm. Every time he expected people to lose interest, more people seemed drawn toward him. Finally, Travis stood and walked across the yard. Several inmates immediately noticed. Conversations grew quieter. Kevin looked up from his paperwork as Travis approached. Samuel calmly turned another page in his book. Travis stopped directly in front of the bench. You always reading? Samuel looked up. Not always. What are you reading now? Samuel glanced at the cover. A book about leadership. Travis smirked. You planning to run the place? Several inmates nearby listened carefully. Samuel closed the book and looked at him. No, then why read it? Samuel's answer came without hesitation. Because leadership matters even when nobody is following you. The statement caught Travis off guard. He crossed his arms. You always have an answer. Samuel smiled gently. Only after spending years collecting questions. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Travis shook his head and walked away. He had approached expecting satisfaction. Instead, he felt the same thing he felt every time he spoke to Samuel. Confused. Back in the administration building, Raymond reviewed his notes from the morning phone call. One detail stood out more than any other. Before ending the conversation, the woman from the institute had mentioned a name. Colonel James Foster. According to her, if anyone knew Samuel Walker's full story, it would be him. Raymond looked at the note several times before reaching for the phone again. Outside his office window, the afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the prison yard. Samuel sat peacefully beneath the shelter with a book in his hands. He looked like an ordinary elderly inmate enjoying a quiet day. Yet somewhere beyond the prison walls, a man named Colonel James Foster might be holding the final piece of a mystery that was becoming impossible to ignore. The phone conversation with Colonel James Foster lasted less than 15 minutes, but Officer Raymond Cole spent the rest of the day thinking about every word. The retired military officer had been polite at first. Then Raymond mentioned Samuel Walker's name. A long silence followed. Not confusion. Recognition. Genuine recognition. Raymond remembered it clearly. Samuel Walker? Colonel Foster had repeated. Are you absolutely certain? Raymond had confirmed the name. Another pause followed. Then the colonel asked a question that Raymond had not expected. How is he doing? Not who is he? Not why are you calling? How is he doing? The question alone revealed more than the rest of the conversation. Raymond learned very little after that. Colonel Foster refused to discuss details over the phone. However, before ending the call, he made one thing very clear. He wanted to visit Redstone Correctional Facility personally. As Raymond sat in his office that afternoon, those words continued echoing in his mind. Why would a retired colonel travel across the country just to see an elderly inmate? Down in the prison library, Samuel Walker was helping Mrs. Eleanor Price organize a shelf filled with donated biographies. Kevin Brooks sat nearby working through another correspondence course assignment. The library had become one of the busiest places inside Redstone. More inmates visited each week. Some came for books. Others came simply because Samuel was there. I think people keep showing up because of you, Kevin said while reviewing his notes. Samuel placed another book onto the shelf. That would be unfortunate. Kevin laughed. Why? Because they should come for the books. Mrs. Price smiled from behind the circulation desk. You know that is not what he means. Samuel shrugged playfully. I can always hope. The simple exchange caused several nearby inmates to smile. Samuel had a way of making people feel comfortable. Even difficult conversations somehow felt lighter around him. Later that afternoon, recreation time brought everyone into the yard beneath a bright autumn sky. Samuel sat on his usual bench reading, while Kevin worked through a business management workbook. Several inmates approached throughout the afternoon asking questions about classes, careers, and family relationships. Samuel gave each person his full attention. Across the yard, Travis Miller watched everything. The situation had become impossible to ignore. More and more inmates respected Samuel. More and more people sought his advice. Yet the old man never acted like a leader. That contradiction frustrated Travis. One of his friends sat beside him. "You know, you could just ask him." Travis looked over. "Ask him what? Why everybody listens to him?" Travis frowned. The suggestion seemed ridiculous. Yet the thought stayed with him. For the first time, he wondered whether he was more curious than annoyed. Nearby, Samuel finished helping another inmate understand a course assignment and returned to his book. A few minutes later, Kevin glanced up from his workbook. "Can I ask something?" Samuel smiled. "You already are." Kevin shook his head. "A real question. Those are usually the dangerous ones." Kevin leaned forward. "Have you ever been famous?" Samuel looked genuinely surprised. Then he laughed. No. Kevin narrowed his eyes. That answer sounded suspicious. Samuel closed the book resting on his lap. Recognition is a strange thing. Some people spend their lives chasing it. Others spend their lives avoiding it. Kevin considered the response carefully. "Which one were you?" Samuel looked toward the open sky above the prison yard. "I spent many years learning that neither one matters very much." The answer only deepened the mystery. Meanwhile, inside the administration building, Warden Thomas Grant stepped into Raymond's office. "You have been distracted all week." Raymond nodded. "I know." The warden glanced at the conference brochure sitting on the desk. "Still thinking about Walker?" "More than ever." Raymond handed him the printed photograph. The warden studied it carefully. "This is him, 20 years younger." Grant looked back toward the prison yard visible through the office window. "And a colonel wants to visit him?" Raymond nodded. "Personally." The warden set the photograph down. "Interesting." Raymond leaned back in his chair. "I have a feeling we still only know a small part of the story." The next morning, shortly after sunrise, a message arrived confirming Colonel Foster's visit. He would be at Redstone within 48 hours. Raymond read the confirmation twice before setting it aside. Outside, inmates were already moving toward breakfast. Among them walked Samuel Walker carrying his familiar paperback book beneath one arm. He looked exactly the same as he always had. Calm, unhurried, unimpressed by attention. Yet somewhere beyond the prison walls, a respected colonel was preparing to travel hundreds of miles to see him. And inside Redstone, the mystery surrounding Samuel Walker was about to become impossible for anyone to ignore. The news of an upcoming visitor spread through Redstone Correctional Facility faster than any official announcement. Nobody knew all the details, but inmates had a remarkable ability to sense when something unusual was happening. By the second day, rumors were moving through every housing unit. Some believed a politician was coming. Others thought it was a former judge. A few insisted it involved a high-profile investigation. Only Officer Raymond Cole knew the truth, and even he understood only part of it. Colonel James Foster was coming to see Samuel Walker. The mystery was no longer whether Samuel had an unusual past. The mystery was how significant that past had really been. Meanwhile, Samuel moved through his normal routine without the slightest sign of concern. He spent the morning helping Mrs. Eleanor Price sort donated books before joining Kevin Brooks in the library reading area. Kevin looked up from a leadership textbook and smiled. "You know everybody is talking." Samuel opened a book and settled into his chair. "That usually happens when people run out of better things to do." Kevin laughed. "No, seriously. Something is going on." Samuel turned a page. "Something is always going on." Kevin shook his head. "You are impossible." Samuel smiled. "That is one theory." The younger inmate stared at him for several seconds before laughing again. No matter how direct the question, Samuel somehow answered without giving away anything he did not wish to reveal. Across the prison yard later that afternoon, Travis Miller sat with several members of his group beneath the recreation shelter. The conversation eventually drifted towards Samuel, as it often did now. One inmate leaned forward. "I heard somebody important is coming to visit him." Another nodded. "A military guy." Travis frowned. "Who told you that?" "People talk." Travis looked toward the far side of the yard where Samuel sat with Kevin reviewing paperwork from a correspondence course. The old man looked exactly the same as always. Calm, relaxed, uninterested in attention. Yet every day seemed to produce another clue suggesting that he had once lived a very different life. Travis found himself remembering the stolen lunch from weeks earlier. At the time, he had expected fear. Then he expected anger. Instead, he had received neither. The memory bothered him now for a different reason. For the first time, he wondered whether he had completely misunderstood the man sitting across from him that day. Inside the administration building, Raymond prepared for the colonel's arrival. Warden Thomas Grant stepped into the office carrying a folder. "Everything ready?" Raymond nodded. "As ready as it can be." The warden sat down across from him. "Do you think Walker knows?" Raymond considered the question. "Probably." "You think someone told him?" Raymond looked through the office window toward the yard. "No. I think he is the kind of person who notices things." The answer felt accurate. Samuel always seemed aware of more than he said. That evening, shortly before lights out, Kevin found Samuel sitting alone near the common area window reading beneath a soft overhead light. The prison had grown unusually quiet. Kevin hesitated before sitting down. "Can I ask one more question?" Samuel smiled without looking up. "You ask that every day." Kevin laughed. "Fair point." He grew serious. "Do you ever miss your old life?" For several moments, Samuel said nothing. He slowly closed the book resting in his lap and looked out the window into the darkness beyond the prison yard. "Every person misses certain chapters of their life," he said softly. Kevin waited. "What matters is remembering that chapters are not the entire story." The answer lingered in the silence that followed. It felt personal, more personal than anything Samuel had shared before. The next morning, shortly after sunrise, a dark government vehicle passed through the outer security gate of Redstone Correctional Facility. Officers noticed immediately. Inmates noticed soon afterward. The vehicle parked near the administration building entrance. A tall man with silver hair stepped out wearing a simple suit rather than a military uniform. Despite his age, he carried himself with unmistakable confidence. Colonel James Foster had arrived. Inside the administration building, Raymond Cole met him at the entrance. The colonel shook his hand politely. "Thank you for seeing me." Raymond nodded. "You came a long way." Foster smiled faintly. "Some people are worth the trip." As they began walking through the building, Raymond studied the older man's expression. It was not curiosity. It was respect. Genuine respect. The kind usually reserved for mentors, teachers, and people who leave permanent marks on other lives. And in that moment, Raymond realized the biggest revelation might not be who Samuel Walker used to be. The biggest revelation might be how many remarkable people still remembered him. Colonel James Foster's arrival created a quiet tension throughout Redstone Correctional Facility. Nobody officially announced why he was there, yet word spread quickly. Officers noticed. Staff noticed. Inmates noticed. Even people who had never spoken to Samuel Walker suddenly found themselves wondering what kind of man could attract a visitor like this. Inside the administration building, Colonel Foster sat across from Warden Thomas Grant and Officer Raymond Cole. The retired military officer looked around the office before his eyes settled on the old conference brochure lying on the desk. He smiled immediately. "I have not seen that photograph in years." Raymond leaned forward. "So it is him." Foster looked at the younger version of Samuel standing before a crowded auditorium. Without question, the room fell silent. Raymond finally asked the question that had consumed him for weeks. Who exactly was he? Colonel Foster smiled faintly. "You are asking the wrong question." Raymond frowned. "I am." Foster nodded. "The better question is how many people became better because of him." A few moments later, the colonel stood and looked through the office window toward the prison grounds. "May I see him?" Down in the library, Samuel was helping Mrs. Eleanor Price organize another shipment of donated books. Kevin Brooks sat nearby reviewing course materials while several inmates quietly browsed shelves. The room felt peaceful, familiar. Then the door opened. Officer Raymond Cole entered first. Behind him walked Colonel James Foster. The moment Samuel looked up, a warm smile appeared on his face. "James." The colonel laughed softly. "You still recognize me after all these years." Samuel stood and extended his hand. Foster ignored it and pulled him into a brief embrace instead. The entire room froze. Kevin nearly dropped his notebook. Mrs. Price stared openly. Even Raymond looked surprised. The respect in the colonel's face was impossible to miss. When they stepped back, Foster shook his head with a smile. "You look exactly the same." Samuel laughed. "That is a generous observation." "No," Foster replied. "It is accurate." Kevin looked between them in disbelief. For weeks he had wondered who Samuel really was. Now he was watching a decorated colonel greet him like an old mentor. Foster turned toward the others in the room. "You all know him as Samuel Walker." Several people nodded. The colonel smiled. "I know him as the man who trained some of the finest leaders I have ever met." Silence filled the library. Raymond folded his arms and listened carefully. Foster continued. "Years ago, organizations from all over the country asked Samuel to teach leadership, decision-making, communication, and responsibility. Military officers, law enforcement professionals, corporate executives, community leaders. Thousands of people sat in classrooms hoping to learn from him." Kevin stared at Samuel. "Thousands?" Foster nodded. "And every one of us thought we were getting the better end of the deal." Samuel shook his head. "You are exaggerating." "Not enough." The colonel's voice carried absolute sincerity. He turned toward Kevin. "I have worked with generals, governors, and chief executives. Many of them still quote lessons they learned from this man." Kevin looked speechless. Across the prison yard outside, word had already begun spreading that something unusual was happening in the library. More inmates slowly drifted toward the windows. Among them was Travis Miller. He stood near the entrance, unable to hear every word, but able to see the expressions on people's faces. Respect. Genuine respect. The same kind of respect Samuel had somehow inspired from the beginning. Inside the library, Raymond finally asked the question everyone had been carrying. Why did nobody know any of this? Samuel answered before the colonel could. Because it happened a long time ago. Foster shook his head. No, because you never cared whether people knew. Samuel smiled gently. Recognition has never been the goal. The colonel looked around the room. That right there is why people listened to him. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Kevin glanced at the old paperback book resting on the table beside Samuel. Suddenly everything made sense. The patience, the wisdom, the calm confidence, the ability to help people feel capable of more than they believed possible. Samuel had never been pretending to be a teacher inside Redstone. He had simply never stopped being one. And as inmates gathered outside the library windows and whispers spread through the prison, a realization began settling over everyone who had doubted him. The quiet old man whose lunch had been taken in front of the entire cafeteria had never been powerless. He had simply possessed a kind of strength that most people failed to recognize until it was standing directly in front of them. The days following Colonel James Foster's visit felt different inside Redstone Correctional Facility. Nothing about the official schedule had changed. The gates still opened and closed on time. Count procedures remained exactly the same. Meals were served according to routine. Yet something invisible had shifted. People looked at Samuel Walker differently now. Not because he demanded respect. Not because he asked for attention. They looked at him differently because they finally understood what had been in front of them all along. Kevin Brooks noticed it first. As he walked through the library one afternoon, he watched several inmates stop to thank Samuel for advice they had received over the previous weeks. Some had enrolled in educational programs. Others had written letters to family members they had avoided for years. A few had simply started believing they could become better versions of themselves. Samuel accepted every thank you with the same response. A smile. A nod. Then he returned to whatever he had been doing. Kevin shook his head in amazement. "You know what is strange?" he asked while placing books onto a shelf. Samuel glanced over. "There are many strange things." Kevin laughed. "People finally know who you are." Samuel carefully arranged another biography. "People know part of who I am. That does not bother you." Samuel smiled. "No person can be summarized by a title." Across the room, Mrs. Eleanor Price listened quietly and smiled. She understood exactly what he meant. For weeks, she had watched inmates arrive carrying questions and leave carrying hope. Whatever Samuel had accomplished before prison mattered far less than what he continued doing every day. Meanwhile, Travis Miller sat alone in the recreation yard. That alone would have surprised many people. For years, he had surrounded himself with followers. Now he found himself wanting silence. The revelation about Samuel had forced him to confront something uncomfortable. He remembered the lunch tray, the stolen sandwich, the smirk on his own face. Most of all, he remembered Samuel's words. You can take the meal. Just do not lose your character while you are taking it. At the time, he had dismissed the statement. Now it felt completely different. For the first time, he realized Samuel had not been trying to protect himself. He had been trying to protect Travis from becoming someone worse. Late that afternoon, Travis finally walked across the yard toward the familiar bench where Samuel sat reading beneath the shade structure. Several inmates noticed immediately. Kevin looked up from a nearby table. Officer Raymond Cole paused during his routine patrol. Samuel closed his book as Travis approached. "Mind if I sit down?" Travis asked. Samuel smiled. "It is a public bench." Travis sat quietly for a moment. The words he wanted to say felt unfamiliar. "I owe you an apology." Samuel looked at him calmly. "For what?" Travis stared at the ground. "You know for what." Samuel waited. Travis took a slow breath. "I thought taking something from you would make me look stronger." Samuel nodded. "And did it?" Travis gave a small laugh. "Not exactly." For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Samuel leaned back against the bench. Most people spend years learning the difference between strength and control. Travis looked over. "You figured it out?" Samuel smiled. "I am still learning." The answer surprised him. Even now, after everything that had been revealed, Samuel refused to place himself above anyone else. Travis shook his head. "I do not understand how you do that." "Do what?" "Talk to people like they matter, even after they treat you badly." Samuel looked toward the open sky beyond the prison yard. "Because people often become whatever expectations surround them." Travis listened carefully. Samuel continued. "Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is remind someone they can be better than their worst moment." The words settled heavily between them. Travis lowered his eyes. For the first time in years, he felt genuinely humbled. As evening approached, the prison yard gradually emptied. Inmates returned to their housing units. Officers completed their rounds. The day slowly faded into another quiet sunset over Redstone. Kevin sat beside Samuel one last time before final count. "Can I ask a final question?" Samuel laughed softly. "You have asked that before." Kevin smiled. "This time I mean it." Samuel closed his book and waited. Kevin thought carefully before speaking. "After everything you accomplished, what do you want people to remember?" Samuel looked across the yard where dozens of men were walking back toward their units. Some carried books. Some carried class assignments. Some carried hopes they had not possessed a few months earlier. Finally, he answered, "I do not want them to remember me." Kevin looked confused. Samuel smiled gently. "I want them to remember that every person has the ability to become more than they are today." The evening bell echoed across the prison grounds. Samuel stood, tucked the paperback book beneath his arm, and began walking toward the housing unit. Around him, conversations continued. Lives continued. Lessons continued. And as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, everyone who had truly met Samuel Walker understood the same thing. The strongest man in Redstone had never been the one who could take something from others. He was the one who spent every day helping others discover something within themselves.